My name is Lisa Feinstein, and I'm the Associate Dean of the JD program here at the Faculty of Law. I'm welcoming you to our Distinguished Visitors series. It is sponsored by the D.A. Thompson Fund. We're very thankful for the generous support. And today we are really in for a privilege. I had to wake up this morning at 6 in the morning in order to hear Professor Perrin do his presentation. You have the luxury of a lovely morning and now at a noon hour being wonderfully informed on a very timely topic, which is human trafficking. And so you are going to have a wonderful presentation. Professor Perrin has just finished the book, Canada's Underground World of Human Trafficking, Invisible Chains. I was so impressed with his talk, I bought the book. So that's, and I'm here again. I think that makes me a stalker. Professor Perrin is on faculty at the University of British Columbia, and he is also on faculty as an associate of the Lau Institute for Global Issues and the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies. He has numerous other accolades, but I think better time is spent with him. So I'm going to turn the mic over to Professor Perrin.
Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us today. I'm going to be talking about an issue that, for myself, probably like many of you, I assumed was simply something that happened overseas. I thought that this was something that happened in countries like Cambodia, Thailand, Romania, Moldova, the Ukraine. And in fact, it does happen in those countries. And I initially started working on this issue before I was even a law student, over 10 years ago. And it was volunteering abroad in Cambodia working with victims of child sex trafficking. And so what I'm going to do is, first of all, I assume that most of you have never met, at least not that you know, a victim of human trafficking. Would you agree with me on that? Probably, yeah? Some people have worked with them, I know, in the room. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a short clip from a documentary. It's 8 minutes long, so it is quite brief. And it's going to allow you to hear from traffickers and from survivors of these traffickers about what they went through. Some of it is hard-hitting, and you should know that the producers of the documentary did a really good job. One of their policies was that they were not going to interview anyone who hadn't already gone through an extensive rehabilitation period and who wanted to tell their stories. So there's some documentaries that don't take that kind of ethical step. So I'm going to show you that documentary, and then I'm going to come back and share with you not just about the research findings about the existence of human trafficking in Canada. It's going to be a bit of a different talk from this morning, which I think is a good thing, so we're not saying through the same thing twice. I'm going to focus in my talk today about how, at a law school, you can advance positive change. And how do you go about researching what is really a very serious underground criminal activity? Because it had a whole bunch of challenges associated with it. And we'll talk a lot about human trafficking through that, but I want to infuse that because this is a group of people here who I hope through this talk, in whatever your area of work is, that you'll see that there's some other ways that you can perhaps more effectively or rapidly advance a research agenda or change from a university setting, which is really why I went into being a professor in the first place. It was by being inspired as a law student from some really great professors who brought me into real-life projects. I didn't want to write papers, get a mark, and call it quits. So just to give you one example, at the University of McGill University, Professor René Prévost ran a legal clinic for the Special Court for Sierra Leone. So we were sitting in Montreal doing legal research and writing memos for the judges in Freetown who were in real time trying real-live war crimes cases. And that's what opened my mind, the fact that law professors didn't just teach and write articles. So I hope to inspire you. But as I said, it's going to start a little bit tough, and we're going to get to that hopeful point near the end, I promise you. And we will definitely have time for a lot of discussion and questions at the end. So without any further ado, I'm going to show you this excerpt from this documentary. The documentary is called Not My Life.
This phenomenon of modern-day slavery, I'm convinced, exists in every country of the world, including the United States of America.
Trafficking in human beings is not mainly for sexual exploitation. We have for labor, for begging, for organs, for adoption. There are all kinds of exploitation because of their vulnerability. They easily get into these kinds of situations without knowing.
I see me in a mirror, you know, and I don't know, I say, it's not me. I don't know, I can't believe it, I do that.
Trafficker said he would go to very poor areas. He would seek for poor families, and he would go to the parents and ask them if they would be willing to hand him their daughter because he could provide for her a better life.
Nu mă simt vinovat. Deci am fost la bună înțelegere. Eu mă duceam, poate, erau familii care erau mamă și fiică. Și mă duceam la femeile lor care erau amărâți. Și spuneam, măi, decât să stați amăzuiți, să cerșiți sau să, eu știu, mă rog, să furați, să dați în cap.
You can't explain it away by saying, well, some country has such desperate economic circumstances that parents allow their children to work to make more money. Or that culturally it's a natural thing in some countries for a child to be sent to another family to work as a domestic servant and then get enslaved. There's no excuse for that.
You do have mainly girls trafficked from poor regions of the country, but the main reason it's the dysfunctional family, and we are talking the psychological reasons why a girl will end up in a predicament like this. My family, it was drinking, you know, and the people who don't like to work or something. I have 4 brothers. She was basically dropped by her parents in an orphanage. She was disposed of. I was alone and missing the love, the affection, okay. She ended up as a victim of traffic because of the corruption within the system. It was a leakage, someone tipped the traffickers, and that very night the traffickers showed up at her door, broke the door, kidnapped her and her friend, kept them locked for that night, and then shipped them over in Hungary the second day.
When I was in Albania, I heard about some kind of training facility, in the countryside, nearby big cities in Albania. And the girls were, brought from abroad, trained there, then to be sent to the market in Italy mainly, but also to other countries in Europe. And the kind of stories you could hear was, execution of one girl to show to the other ones that they don't have to move. And either shot or burned.
Every time when I say no, I don't want to do that, I don't want. You can beat me, you can do anything you want. He beat me so much, he missing one teeth, and I was pregnant.
I remember several times I have seen, young girls with their breasts all burnt because of cigarettes. I have seen and I have met women that they were shot on the streets. And one of the girls, I remember, she became paralyzed.
Mi hanno detto tante volte che se provo a scappare o se provo a fare qualcosa di male, se mi beccano mi sparano o va a picchiare mia famiglia, sì.
Nu știu, după părerea mea că toată viața o să trăiască cu coșmarul ăsta. Și vezi, unele mai reușesc să se schimbe, dar
Nu o să mai apuce să fie femeie normală niciodată.
I told my baby just the other night, but if you mistreat me, it's gonna be a fight. That is why I like the truth.
I can tell you that in the United States, we're confronted with a situation now where thousands of kids are being trafficked from state to state and throughout our country.
All I know is about the truckers, and out of a truck stop that's got 50 trucks in it, you're probably going to get 46 of them that want you to come. I mean, being 13, I didn't really know what I was supposed to be doing. All I know is what I was told to do day in, day out. I probably met about 30, 40 truckers a day. More likely, maybe even more. I really tried not to keep count.
She was forced to perform different sex acts on these men for different prices, and at the end of the night would turn her money over, all of her money, to this individual.
We jumped the fence. That's really hard to do in high heels. We're walking around. There's lots of semis, and there's also a lot of girls out there, and a lot of them are they look like half our age. They look like they could be like 8 or 9 years old.
You know, Angie's not any different than anyone else's child. She wants love. She wanted to feel some sense of security, and she didn't get that, in her opinion, and made a terrible mistake.
We get in the first truck, and the guy decides he wants me, so I go back there, and I just have to just pray to God, just please help me, just please let me get through it. And then Melissa went through his wallet, and he had grandkids as old as us. And all I could think about the whole time was how my grandpa could be this guy right now, and how that would feel. And I just wanted to die.
Were the ones that I saw firsthand working in Cambodia. So being concerned about the issue, wanting to help some way, and seeing this sort of thing day in and day out while we were working in teams with local Cambodian human rights investigators and with some of the people who had escaped or been rescued from some of the brothels in Cambodia. And we were trying to work to help them. And my background at the time wasn't in law, I was in business. And so one of the things I did is we helped fill a real need, which was some of the young survivors who were 16 to 21 years old, trying to provide them with some sort of vocational training. And they were getting that at these recovery centers. So they were learning basic skills and trades so they could make an income in their villages back in rural Cambodia, or Vietnam for that matter. But it turned out over half of those businesses were failing miserably, because you could teach someone how to cook, to run a roadside restaurant stand, teach someone how to cut hair, you teach someone how to sew clothes in a sort of cottage type industry, but if you don't teach them anything about managing the funds, the first time that sewing machine breaks and there's no money that's been set aside to repair it or purchase a new set of equipment, the business fails, the person's back in a position of vulnerability, and very often the business fail and they fall prey then to these very same associates of the traffickers who recruited them or forcibly abducted them in the first place. And so it was sort of encouraging to see we were making some progress there with programs like that starting in 2001 in Cambodia. But what I could never get over and I couldn't understand is that Canada had a law that would, at the time, and it still exists, criminalize Canadian citizens and permanent residents who travel overseas. It's an extraterritorial criminal law. Now I get to use legal terms. This is great. This morning it was all just lay language. So, which makes it a crime anywhere in the world. It's Section 4.1 of the Criminal Code. I've written an article on that, and there's a couple of cases on it as well now. But at the time, not even a single Canadian had been charged, and the law had been on the books for 4 years. And we knew there were Canadian men doing this because we saw them. We'd meet them in these bars. People would say they're from Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver. Didn't meet anyone from Winnipeg, but I think we'd probably be kidding ourselves if we didn't think there wasn't someone there. And I couldn't understand why we weren't enforcing the law. The United States was enforcing their laws. The Australians had their police liaison officers, but we had no one to be seen. And so that was one of the reasons I decided to go to law school. I realized there wasn't enough skills I had in my tool belt as a business graduate to really do what I wanted to do, which was to try to see how we could enforce some of these international human rights standards that apply to these situations, both to provide support for the victims on the one hand, but then also to hold the perpetrators, both the men purchasing these sex acts and the traffickers, accountable. So that's where it started out. So human trafficking, international problem. I'm going to pursue this as a legal issue. Then I get exposed to the problem of forced labor trafficking through my work over the years. In fact, men could be victims. These are men in Burma who are indentured laborers in the fishing industry. One statistic that Kevin Bales has put out there, and I wholeheartedly agree with him, is that on a numerical basis, there actually are more people currently enslaved through things like bonded labor internationally than there have ever been at any point in history before now. Bonded labor, indentured servitude, is a practice similar to slavery under the United Nations Anti-Slavery Convention. It's a practice that goes back millennia, and it's still being used today. And we see it targeting men in typically what are called the 3D sectors: dirty, difficult, and dangerous jobs. Okay? Fishing, right? In Canada, it's things like agriculture, food processing, hospitality, live-in caregivers, right? You're going to start to see some common themes among the industries where you see forced labor. Now, this is a very funny photo. You can see this youthful, maybe a little bit chubbier. I made a comment about that the other day, and someone said, I actually think you're back to that kind of weight. But certainly an observation would be the really trendy early 2000 hairstyle. Some of that's gone. There's a bit of facial hair. You see, there's some differences here, right? These kids are part of a group in Kampong Cham province in Cambodia that I was trying to, through local teams, we're trying to do prevention education. So teaching them in these rural villages about the tactics used to recruit these young kids. And you can see the ages that we're starting at. That's because these are the same ages of kids that we were meeting later in these safe houses after they'd been rescued from brothels. One of the kids that I came to know really well, I actually dedicate the book to her. Her name is Sevi. She was 9 years old when I met her in a recovery center. I want you to think about the age that she likely would have been when all of her abuse began, which is probably around 6.5 or 7 from what we can tell. The first time she was sold for sex, she didn't even know what was going on. She was sold to a foreign national, and he brutally raped her repeatedly over a weekend. He bought her. Right? He owns her. This is property. That's why this is called modern-day slavery. After that, and my business background kicks in, I said, well, that's your high-value customer, right? I'm trying to break this apart. That you need the foreign sex tourists and the wealthy, but very small segment, the wealthy Cambodian nationals to fuel this industry. That's the biggest purchaser. They want younger kids who are less likely to have STDs like HIV and AIDS in particular. Okay? Once that high-value commodity has been used up, she's then passed into a brothel system. First a high-end brothel, again catering to foreign nationals. Over time, if she had stayed in these brothels, by the time she would have reached 18, she would have been in a place that is called Tul Kork, which is only Cambodian men go. Very low costs are paid. We're talking 50 cents for a sex act. Okay? So she went from being sold for several $1,000s for a weekend. Several years later, she's a disposable, depreciable asset at the end of it, and eventually is either kicked out or let go because she's no longer worth her own keep. This is the crass business-type terms that I was using to try to understand this, because if you start talking to these survivors, you very quickly get overwhelmed emotionally. And so I was trying to use that model, and I realized that makes a little bit of sense, but it certainly didn't help me to make arguments to law enforcement or to policymakers about international treaty obligations that Cambodia and Canada has, for that matter, and how we should be acting and behaving. So there was just some huge gaps I saw in my own thinking on this, and that's why I made the decision to go to law school. So it's in my second year of law school. How many of you are in second year right now? Just raise your hand. Anyone second? We're missing the second years. They have some program, I think. How about first year? We have some first years? Third years? Yeah, okay. So right in between you two groups. And I got a phone call from the Calgary Herald, which is my hometown, and they said, we want to ask you about a human trafficking case. They knew we'd been in Cambodia, and I thought, oh, it must be a local case. Maybe they finally charged a Canadian. And I was in Toronto at the time, studying at U of T, and they said, no, it's a case in Calgary. The police had gone undercover based on an anonymous tip and found a whole network of brothels embedded in the community. These are in like residential areas. And they went undercover posing as gang members who wanted to start their own brothels because they heard you could make a lot of money in this. The traffickers in this case negotiated on a wiretap for the purchase and sale of women from Southeast Asia. They gave the police officers detailed instructions on how to control the women. Don't let them leave together. Don't let them talk together. If they ever are allowed to go out, make sure they're firmly under control. Keep their passports. Find out some information about their families so you can threaten them if you ever need to get to that position. And what ended up happening with that case, after it initially broke, I thought, this is an isolated incident, surely. I mean, this is a one-off kind of deal. At the time in 2003, there was no criminal code offense of human trafficking. So they couldn't charge them with that. So what do? Use prostitution-related offenses. And unlike other countries, which had already brought in measures to help these victims, Canada had failed to implement its treaty obligations under something called the Palermo Protocol, I'll talk about in a bit more detail later. 3 years earlier, we'd promised to give them legal immigration status, that a trafficking victim needs support and help. We didn't have that in place. So what happened? These victims of modern-day slavery were detained and deported. Flash forward 2 years later, the case is making its way through the courts of the traffickers. The wiretap evidence malfunctioned, we're told. All your witnesses are back over who knows where. Most of them probably re-trafficked. That's what a lot of the research around this deportation model shows now. And so what happens is they had one offense that was still able to go forward, keeping a common body house. And the accused, in this case Anthony Lee, was sentenced to a $10,000 fine. That's it. If that case had happened in Cambodia, if victims were locked up in an immigration holding facility and deported and not given access to medical care and emergency counseling, and if the traffickers got off with a $10,000 fine, if that happened in Cambodia, what the future group would have said is, this stinks. This looks like corruption. Well, it wasn't that in Canada. It was a system that was really caught unprepared. We didn't have any laws or policies in place to deal with it because it surely couldn't happen in Canada. So I spent the next 3 years as a law student and then as a graduate student writing to ministers responsible for this, trying to find out what happened to the victims. We only found out much later, right? The whole thing about privacy laws work in actually not always to favor the privacy interests of those people who the government claims to be interested in protecting. It also is a shroud that prevents any kind of government accountability. So it took a lot of work to find out whatever happened to those victims. So in 2006, as a graduate student, a group of students and I, 12 students, forming a working group. That's one of our models we used. Totally ad hoc. It's not a club. We didn't even need a faculty sponsor. We were just 12 people. We got together, concerned law students. What did we do? We did some research. We did some advocacy. We looked at this treaty Canada had signed. We looked at what other Western developed countries had done. And we did something which put a little spin on our research, which made sure we get some media attention. We gave Canada a report card grade. Very easy. You see this all the time. The media loves it. Right? We had a rational basis for giving Canada an F, compared to the US, which got a B+, and Germany and Australia and so forth. And so we had a substantial body of research, but then some really quick sound bites, which would be enough to get the attention of the media and, we thought, the public. Now, not all of this is sort of a well-thought-out plan. A lot of it comes down to chance, I think, or fate, or whatever you choose to believe in. But the brand new immigration minister at the time in 2006, when we put this report out, the report was called Falling Short of the Mark. The brand new immigration minister was Monty Solberg. It's when the Conservative government had just come to power. He was only in office for like 3 or 4 weeks. It's the best time to catch a new minister. They don't really quite know what's going on. But more importantly, he, it turned out, was the keynote speaker at our original fundraising dinner for the very first Cambodian deployment 5 years earlier. So you know who we were. He knew that we had some credibility on the issue. We gave his office an advance copy of the report. It's coming out next week. We're going to slam the heck out of the government, but guess what? You can say it was the previous government if you want. All we want is to say you're going to take the report seriously. And he made that commitment. 6 weeks later, this isn't usually the way you get a job. He hired me. Again, you don't usually get a job by slamming the heck out of your prospective employer, so I'm not recommending that as a career strategy. But it was because he knew that there needed to be some quick fixes done. And I had some time in between that and doing a clerkship. So 6 months, went into the immigration department in Ottawa as a senior policy advisor inside the belly of the beast, so to speak. And within 8 weeks, had handed him the pen, and he signed off on a system which would give temporary residence permits, which can lead to permanent residence and citizenship for trafficking victims who choose to stay in Canada. And we have one of the most effective and generous systems now for trafficked persons, at least from an immigration status perspective, of any country in the world. And it's a bit of a model. It does not require law enforcement cooperation. We don't force them to testify against their trafficker at all. It also came with emergency counseling and health care and so forth. So that was one piece of the puzzle. So we knew that human trafficking involved foreign nationals. And as soon as I started my position at UBC in 2007, I said, we need to get to the bottom of this. There had never been an empirical study on human trafficking in Canada. That's not something most law professors do, right? We're not typically out there as social science investigators. Some of us do that work. So it was a challenge to get going. It takes a lot of money to do empirical research. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of student power. So I'm going to talk to you about how we went about the research and what the findings are. And we're going to focus today, just because of the time and the issues that you're facing here in Manitoba, on one part of human trafficking, and that's domestic sex trafficking. That's the trafficking of Canadian citizens within our own country. Okay. So, first of all, a bit about definitions. The one-line definition of human trafficking is it's treating people like property. We're at a law school, so I'm going to get into a bit more detail. Okay. This is a sort of conceptual map that we developed. Others use it a lot too, but it's adapted from this UN protocol on human trafficking from 2000. And this is the definition. If you read the definition in the protocol, it's kind of hard to follow. So this is why I give you a concept map. There's 3 essential requirements. The first is that trafficking involves any one of these listed acts. So it's recruitment is actually an act of trafficking. Right? See, those are all ors. Or transporting, or transferring, or harboring, or receiving the person. So the person who recruits someone, if it's, as I get to later, using a certain set of means for a certain purpose, they're a trafficker. Right? So recruiters themselves are traffickers. We often just think of the ultimate person who controls the victim, like the individuals you saw in the video. But it's actually far broader than that. Now, any one of those acts needs to be for using one of these listed means. Now, I've organized them in terms of the least egregious to the most egregious. I can tell you in Canada, we have documented cases involving every single one of these means. From deception, right, trickery, threats, physical force, and abductions. That's the Hollywood version of trafficking, right? This is the last one. It's the one that makes the movies like, have anyone seen Taken? Or there's a few other ones like this, right? I watch these movies and I go, give me a break. Sure enough, we actually came across some abduction cases in Canada. So it actually does happen, but very rare. Most common are the ones at the top category, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. So again, it's any one of those acts using any one of those means for any one of these purposes. So I'm focusing today on sex trafficking, but we also have a problem in Canada with forced labor trafficking. We haven't documented any removal of organs cases in Canada, as you may have expected, but there are allegations of Canadians going abroad and purchasing organs for transplants that they need to jump the queue on the transplant list. Servitude and practices similar to slavery and outright slavery. So other than the organ piece, we've actually seen everything else, though, in Canada. We actually did document a case involving a modern-day slave from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, who was a long-term sex slave in that country and was brought to, eventually, Edmonton because they wanted to make more money in North America than during a state of civil war in a Central African country, right? So it's all profit-driven. We had another case, an abduction case, 9-year-old Ukrainian girl, immediately post-Cold War, internationally trafficked for 20 years on 3 continents. She has more frequent flyer points than our federal politicians. Okay. 3 continents, 20 years. The way we know about her case is because she was dumped outside a hospital. She had paranoid schizophrenia, she had physical injuries, and they could no longer find anyone who would pay to abuse her. You often hear stories about, oh, surely people who are also involved in quote-unquote prostitution will talk about these cases. That's how we're going to hear about it. In my experience, in our cases, that's not how these cases are getting reported. Also, people say, well, maybe the men will report them. No. We had 1 or 2 cases like that. Generally, when men arrive and find, for example, they expected someone who was young, but maybe not that young, they will try to just leave the situation. And we documented a case where an individual tells a friend about it, and that friend calls Crime Stoppers, and they're unable to find this person, right? So the way these cases have been identified, typically in Canada until very recently, has been very ad hoc, and in fact, it's really quite tragic because most of them are not caught at a very early stage at all. So this is the sort of framework that we're talking about when we deal with trafficking cases. Now, our research, as I said, is empirical. It was based on interviews with people involved directly in these cases. We did a boatload of access to information requests. We became kind of experts at getting information from government. I would estimate about 20,000 pages of materials. Now, some of you are law students going, wow, just wait until you get into articling and have to go through some civil litigation. 20,000 pages? Pfft, we can handle that, no problem. So it sounds big, it is, but you can do it with a team. These are police incident reports, criminal intelligence reports. We got a lot of case information from this. In some instances, it gave us primary data itself. Other cases, we'd say, oh, there's a person mentioned. Let's interview them, right? So it was a bit of a sort of detective work. And of course, court records and academic sources. We created this thing called the Human Trafficking Working Group. I already had that kind of model from my time at McGill and U of T. So I created a group of students. They were volunteers. 5 hours a week was all I was asking for. They got some experience. They got to meet some people. Some of them got jobs eventually with some of the partner organizations. And they helped do primary research, going through the access filings, doing the digging, doing the research. And in the end, there's about 50 students that worked on this with us. A really remarkable group who still are, many of them, working on the issue. Then there were paid research assistants, work with government, police, Crown, and NGOs. This is the first conviction. So as we're doing the research, these cases are happening in real time, which is a horrible problem. I mean, it's really challenging to stay on top of this. So in the midst of the research, we get our first conviction. Imani Nekpangi, who's pictured here from a court sketch. I'm going to just talk about his case in detail, and the others are going to be maybe come up in discussion, because it's the first one, and it illustrates how traffickers operate. Nekpangi has two totally separate victims, and he uses completely different methods of control to control them at the exact same time. Okay. One's a 15-year-old homeless girl. It's all in the Greater Toronto area. Nekpangi uses physical violence, and when that's not enough, he threatens to kidnap her 3-year-old toddler brother to control her. For 2.5 years, he sells her to thousands and thousands of men in the Greater Toronto area. He pockets all of the money, $360,000 in the end. And the only way we know about the case is eventually this teenage girl, who in the book I call Eve as a pseudonym, she eventually calls the police after she probably feared for her life when Nekpangi blamed her for being robbed by a man who came to pay for a sex act appointment. This is very common, actually, for criminal activity to happen against people who are being trafficked or prostituted, because the crime never gets reported to the police. So this sort of violence is rampant, actually, in criminal activity. It's never reported. So he blames her, saying, you should have screened your clients better. I'm coming down to deal with you. That eventually is enough for her to overcome his prior threats, and she calls 911, and that's how we know about this case. The second victim, simultaneously, he recruits himself. How does he do that? 14 years old. She has fetal alcohol syndrome. And he finds her by driving around group homes in Brampton, Mississauga. These guys know where these are. And I know from speaking and interviewing people who work in this area in Winnipeg that you have male sex act purchasers and traffickers who know where your safe houses and shelters are, and they go around and they sit and wait out front. This is exactly how it works. Your first case, I don't know if any of you know this, where human trafficking charges were laid in this province, took place about a year ago. It was a female trafficker, not the first time we've seen that, who targeted an Aboriginal youth shelter. So you wonder how people can get recruited. I think you're beginning to sort of see that the tactics are quite well rehearsed, and the traffickers suit their methods to the vulnerability of the victim. So while Samantha fears for her safety, Eve fears for her safety, that's the 15-year-old I mentioned, the other one believes that he's the boyfriend. He's the knight in shining armor. And to this day, she still believes that. She tried to get money for getting him out on bail when he was coming up for bail. So a very difficult case. Here's the victim impact statement from Eve. She says, I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, afraid either Imani or his friends are going to come after me for putting him in jail. I don't feel safe at home. He knows where I live and what my family looks like and where they live. I have nightmares about him. I have low self-esteem. I don't see why someone, a man, would be interested in me and to try to get to know me because I feel unworthy, dirty, tainted. Nothing. Basically lost 2.5 to 3 years of my life with Imani. I want you to think for a second, what would your life be like if you just had suddenly lost from age 15 to 18? That period of your life, that development, those experiences were erased, and they were replaced with this. I can tell you wouldn't be here right now, sitting in a law school. You wouldn't be wearing the clothes you're wearing. There might be some other visible marks of what you've gone through. For her, he branded her. He tattooed his name on the back of her neck, like a piece of cattle. And he's not the only trafficker. This has been documented across Canada and the United States as a tactic used to dehumanize and to claim victims. Well, I'm happy to let you know, because the Peel Police stepped up to the plate. There was no system in Ontario at the time to help victims. They went out and found volunteers like dentists to help with dental hygiene. They found a pro bono tattoo artist who helped to conceal that tattoo. His name is now completely gone, and it's concealed in this beautiful floral design, a lotus flower. Lotus flowers grow in the muck. They're kind of turbid water, but they're so beautiful, and this has become a bit of a symbol. And other survivors in Canada who have had their names of their traffickers inked in their skin have taken on the same tattoo. I've seen the photos, and it's really inspiring. She's moved out of the province of Ontario. She's got her high school now. Okay? She's moved on with her life. And so have so many other victims. It just amazes me when I talk to some survivors and ask, well, what do you want to do now that you're in control of your own life? And it's amazing how many of them choose careers helping others, social workers, nurses. Those professions keep coming up again and again. I think it really should inspire us to realize how much is possible and how resilient victims are if they're able to get that support to become survivors. It's not just me. The Criminal Intelligence Service of Canada has also documented this. This is an excerpt from their Strategic Intelligence Report. It shows the profits. This is why human traffickers make the money. This is just an example of the number of victims, how much daily, weekly, and annual profit. The estimated daily profit here, $900, that can be quite low. There's one case in Ontario that's going to trial in December where I'm being called as an expert witness, and the allegation in that case is the trafficker made $6,000 per night off of his victim. $6,000 per night, including allegedly by selling her at a strip club in Vancouver and on what's called the so-called high track. So it's not just Nick Pangi, it's a national problem. These are just our major findings, national in scope. We have all forms of sex and labor trafficking. The victims aren't just foreign nationals, but Canadians, adults and children, women and men. In terms of numbers, this is a hard thing for criminologists to do, so we didn't try to get into the game of coming up with a number, but we were confident in saying that there are hundreds, perhaps thousands, of victims exploited annually, and you'll see from some more recent statistics that's quite reasonable. How are they recruited? Well, for domestic victims out of group homes and Aboriginal shelters, centers for abused women, walking home from school, at high schools, by classmates, shopping malls, bus stations, parks, and on Facebook. We have cases for all of these, more than you'd care to know about. And we also have cases of Canadian women like Jessie Foster who have been trafficked to the United States. $10,000 is how much a Canadian woman is worth. The average age of a law student, I want you to look at Jessie. Like she could have been a law student at a school like this or at UBC. She grew up in Kamloops, worked at Boston Pizza. She met a guy who thought he was a boyfriend, took her to Florida. The next thing you know, he's forcing her to repay the plane ticket, cutting off contact with her family. And eventually she completely vanishes in Las Vegas, Nevada. That estimate's from the Edmonton police. We have so many more cases that I don't have time to talk about. This is just an example of the clinical language used in the RCMP reports that we obtain through access requests. It's not Jessie's case, it's another one. Lured from Edmonton to Las Vegas, raped and beaten, then flown to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Raped and beaten again, then forced into prostitution. No charges laid. Victim's terrified. She's back home but doesn't want anything to do with a prosecution against the people who did this to her. So there's this typical framework that I don't have too much time to get into now, but I'm introducing it so that if there's questions, we can delve into this in more detail. The 3 Ps are often called, and this all comes from that international treaty. The great thing about international treaties, even though many governments don't actually follow them, is it gives you, first of all, a standard to hold them accountable to in a public forum. Even if there's no mechanism, there's no committee, for example, like the UN Human Rights Committee, or there's no court I can go to internationally to show Canada's violating these norms, and here's a remedy we should get. We don't have a regional court or like the European Court of Human Rights or the Inter-American Court, for example. So what do I do in Canada? Well, I'm going to use this treaty to hold the government to certain standards. Right? And then, of course, as some of you know, there is a role for treaties that Canada's ratified but not implemented under charter litigation and and at least in political debate. So there's a role for these treaties. We could talk more about how you use human rights treaties to advance changes in governmental policy, but that's something we've really latched onto. The Criminal Code includes a number of different provisions, and we can talk about these in detail. The Immigration Act also has some provisions, too. It's not enough just to go after the traffickers, as everyone I think in the room would appreciate. Victim services, which are generally provincial responsibilities, are vast. I'm just giving you a laundry list here to show the full scope of services. And they're very unique. A lot of people analogize this problem to domestic abuse, right? And there actually are some very helpful analogies there. But if you sort of build your response around that, and I say to you, okay, so you've lined up a whole network of women's shelters, that's where you're going to help victims. Yeah, maybe they might work. All right, how about this? There's an Indian food restaurant where the men are indentured laborers in forced labor, and their families back home have been threatened that if they ever leave this job, the families back home will be harmed. Can you tell me, if I call you today, what your service is in the province of Manitoba for that? Well, there actually is a hotline I can call now in Manitoba. Okay? But most provinces don't have that sort of network, and most provinces probably would scratch their heads really hard to think about where to put someone like that and where they could best have their needs met. The consequences of not having a network and a coordinated system for this is the victims pay the price. So we documented cases involving children locked in immigration detention in Quebec. This is 5 years after that case in Calgary I mentioned. We still haven't learned the lesson. They're being detained for their safety, we're told, segregated from adults, because that's the policy, and spending 1 month in segregated immigration detention as a child victim of human trafficking, terrified, of course. Right? This is why it's called often double victimization. So we need to get our act in order nationally on this front. This is a poster. Some of you have seen this. How many of you have come across the Stop Sex with Kids campaign? Have any of you seen these? Raise your hands high if you have. Yeah. This is a really, really interesting campaign. Prevention needs to involve combating demand, and that includes both public education and awareness, but also criminal prosecutions for the Sex Act purchasers that are driving demand. We can talk about the debate around the prostitution challenge in the Bedford case and that, and the model that Sweden takes, which I, in my research, found is very persuasive and advocate. Sweden took this approach saying, well, the status quo doesn't work. We shouldn't be criminalizing people who are prostituted. But we're not sure the legalization is a good way to go either, because that doesn't seem to work either. We can again get into this in a lot of detail. It's quite a hot debate now. Sweden says there must be another way. Right? Swedes are known for this, right? How many of you have got IKEA furniture in your house? You know, they come up with really creative solutions, and they did it for this too. I use humor, by the way, to break the ice on these tough topics, and my students write on their evaluations. I got one once said, "I like your mildly cheesy but inoffensive humor." So I'll take that. It's inoffensive, but it is mildly cheesy. So fair enough. What Sweden does is says, we're going to go after demand, so it's a crime to purchase a sex act. That's a crime. Public, private, doesn't matter. It's driving demand for exploitation and fueling inequality in society. But we're not going to prosecute anymore, ever again, those who are being sold, those who are being prostituted. Instead, we're going to put $32 million into an action plan to provide them with exit opportunities. That's what we're going to do. And a recent inquiry by a Swedish judge reviewed their 10-year history on this law and these policies and programs and found that it worked. So that's what I've recommended Canada adopt, and one of your local MPs, Joyce Smith, is behind that. The Standing Committee on the Status of Women endorsed the idea. And so I'm hopeful that as these cases move through the courts, both in Ontario and BC, challenging our prostitution laws, that the Swedish model will at least be something that, regardless of the outcome of these judicial decisions, is an option that's on the table for Parliament to consider. Finally, what I want to leave you with is this excerpt from one of the most alarming things I came across in our research, and this came from police who found manuals that traffickers use to teach them how to identify, target, recruit, control victims. It's a playbook. This is an excerpt from that, which I'm ashamed to tell you is now available in Kindle edition, and you can buy this thing on Amazon.com. Here's the excerpt. This is just a paragraph from this book. And I apologize that it's graphic, but I think it makes an important point that we all need to hear. It says, you'll start to dress her, think for her, own her. If you and your victim are sexually active, slow it down. After sex, take her shopping for one item. Hair and or nails is fine. I call this a recipe for exploitation, right? It goes on. She'll develop a feeling of accomplishment. Then the shopping after a month will be replaced with cash. The lovemaking turns into raw sex, and she'll start to crave the intimacy and be willing to get back into your good graces. after you have broken her spirit, she has no sense of self-value. Now, pimp, put a price tag on the item you've manufactured. So this is what we're up against. This is from 1998. We don't have a national action plan yet. Traffickers are better funded, better organized, and I hate to say more efficient than the very small number of motivated people who are tasked with combating them. Now, there's a lot being done in your province you should be proud of. I talked about it a little bit this morning. There's certainly more that can be done. This is what we've been able to accomplish. So it's not just publishing a book. The reason I went with a trade publisher, okay, wasn't just so that people would actually read my book. And I don't say that to disparage academic publishing. I'm doing that too in other publications. But my academic books are small volume. Everyone in the room who does this will know this. The book I'm publishing with CRC Press and the other one with UBC Press coming out this year, they're $100 each. They're going to be exactly the same, but they're $100. That's what they need to price it at in order to even break even. Okay? Because they only sell 500 copies if you're lucky. Everyone's kind of like, oh, the professor's like, it's true. And most of us are brought by us and given as Christmas gifts for people. It's called self-depreciating humor. I'm happy to tell you this is a bestseller. And it's because we made it part of our mission to inform Canadians. And we did it in a way that's very rigorous. There's 40 pages of endnotes, unnumbered endnotes. We got really creative with this. Joel Bakken, who's a colleague of mine, who wrote The Corporation. How many of you have seen that movie or read the book? Joel and I talked. This is his publisher. He got me involved with his editor. He does academic publishing for a public audience with a lot of academic rigor. We got Penguin for the first time in their history that I know of in a nonfiction book to have a section on methodology where we talk about our behavioral ethics approval, okay, in this book. It's all in there. So, but if the average public member doesn't care, they don't read that part. Right? So that's the sort of thing that we did. Now, what has come out of this was a national public awareness campaign last year. We had a couple of objectives. The first was we wanted a national action plan, and we have detailed recommendations on what that is. And I say we because there's a big group of stakeholders now involved in this. We just, in the last federal election, got the governing party on board. The opposition parties were already on board. The government in its platform put in a commitment for $20 million starting this fiscal year coming up for a national action plan on human trafficking. And we've been working with the Public Safety Minister's office to recommend what specifically needs to be in there now that the rubber hits the road. So that was our big ask, and it's in the process. The next is we've changed laws. We proposed a private members bill. Most of these are just kind of trying to raise awareness about issues. We actually got it into law. It's Bill C-268. It's a law against child trafficking, tightening up the sentencing on that when we found that was a problem. It's the only private members bill to become law since the 2008 federal election. And Joy Smith is the one we got to propose it. Right? So it's a huge accomplishment. That built a bit of a movement around the issue. So what did we do? We went after one of the private companies we saw were really facilitating this, Craigslist, the medium of choice, we were told, for advertising victims. We succeeded in getting 6 provincial attorneys general and the federal attorney general on board to call for Craigslist to do what they did in the US and shut down their erotic services section. I had to threaten a private criminal prosecution against them. You imagine how much fun that was to put your neck out like that. We had the evidence to do it. And they eventually just shut down the site. Police, judicial, and Crown training is now picking up. The National Judicial Institute is going to have a half day on this in their Halifax conference in March, which is great. The next book is with one of my former RAs, now a doctoral student at McGill, with a publisher who reaches out to law enforcement and lawyers, so Carswell, right? Go with a real good publisher who can reach that market. And it's going to be more of a legal manual, really, on the investigation, prosecution, and trial. Community engagement, we work a lot with, I do a lot of public events like the one today because issues like this are not going to get dealt with by publishing only in academic journals. It needs to get much more people aware. Media, social media was a huge part of this. I think we did a count. There have been over 500 media articles that our research has been cited in or I've given contributions for in the last 5 years. 500 different forms of media. So it's starting to break through a little bit. And of course, the traditional academic publications are of substantial value. Those will be quoted, hopefully, in litigation, for instance. They're of value to share information in a form and content that's peer-reviewed, that will allow for it to be more authoritative with other researchers. So you can see it's a kind of complicated picture. But again, it's because we have such a big team behind it. So I'm going to end there. And I'd love to, and I know we have a bit of time. If people need to go at any point, please do so. But I'm here to chat with you for at least maybe a few minutes after our scheduled time. I don't want to go too far over maybe, but maybe take about just 10 or 15 minutes. Sound good? Okay. So I'd love to hear your questions, comments, and you certainly feel free to follow up with me, and that's the website for this campaign, this public campaign we've launched, invisiblechains.ca. So I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. Who'd like to lead off? Stunned is usually the response I get, by the way. That's fine. But yeah, thank you.
Just a question about the legalization versus Swedish model versus criminalization. I know that's a really hot debate, and I don't want to get you into the whole thing, but can you just comment on that in terms of your theories on why the legalization method isn't desirable?
Sure. So the argument that's being made about, first of all, I don't support the current criminal code provisions dealing with the criminalization of people who are being sold for sex. So that should be clear. I don't agree with the status quo. The problem with, and I looked at legalization very seriously. I didn't come with any preconceived notions. A lot of people do. Fair enough. I didn't. I started looking at it just in its entirety. The theory is if you legalize it, then you can regulate it, right? You can make it safer. It's a harm reduction strategy, right? That's the basic premise behind it. There's a fundamental difference between harm reduction strategies in something like drug use, though, and prostitution, right? This is not a user and an inanimate object. These are individuals, right? The drug is a person, if you draw out the analogy. So that's why harm reduction immediately is on a really shaky basis, in my view. So, but I did do the homework, and we looked into specific instances. We did case studies. Holland has had to shut down vast sections of its red light district due to infiltration of organized crime. Right? So organized crime increases when you normalize prostitution. There are also, in other countries like New Zealand, which is often now put up as the example since Holland is not in favor now, what the recent public report in New Zealand found was that most of the illegal brothels are still operating, and the conditions are just as bad as they've always been. So you don't bring that part in. If you run a government-approved brothel system, you're going to have issues which say there's public health concerns now. So you have to be over 18. So a lot of what we're dealing with is under 18, so that's going to keep going on, okay, first of all. You're also, there's no country in the world that will legalize prostitution and allow you to be in a government-approved brothel if you have an STD or if you have a substance addiction, okay? Everyone see that? You could not do that, right? It's basic health and occupational safety kind of thing for the customer to protect them. So what do? They make it an offense. So again, we're criminalizing the people being sold, interestingly, under a legalization regime, okay? We call it a regulatory offense, though. But we make it an offense for you to be in a government brothel as a prostitute with an STD. That's, for example, in Australia's state of Victoria. And there's mandatory health checks that are required. Now, if we're trying to protect that person, the person being sold, do you find it a little odd that there's no parallel requirement that the men coming do not have to come with a clean bill of health? They don't. There's absolutely nothing that prevents them from coming in, unless you want to make, now if someone's thinking of you and Chuck, great, you know, unless you want to make some sort of consent-based argument about it's really a sexual assault, because anyone going there? No? Oh, wow, come on. You get kind of creative on that, but the point is that the regulatory framework, in my opinion, because of these hypocrisies, really demonstrate that it's about normalizing the purchase of sex act. And there's a lot of people who make a lot of money off prostitution. Now, not everyone who's involved in prostitution is under the control of a trafficker. I'm not making that claim. I haven't made that claim at all. That's a subset, okay? But what we have done, if we look at the broad statistics and research, is the vast majority, we're talking 85 to 95%, depending on which study you prefer, are involved in being sold for sex because of substance abuse, poverty. They had at one point been under the control of a trafficker or a pimp or an abusive father or male relative. Okay? The example I give, and I don't take any pleasure in giving it, but I think it's important people know, Terry Jean Bedford, who's the lead applicant in the case challenging these laws in Ontario, who stands up today with her riding crop and says, I choose to be a prostitute. How dare you deny my choice? Notice that word's always being used, right? You can't consent to being exploited, by the way, right? Her affidavit in court does not speak to going to a high school guidance counselor and saying you could be a lawyer, a webmaster, a mechanic, an environmentalist. That's not how she became involved in prostitution. It was as a minor, I think it was 16 years old, she became involved with an individual who was over twice her age, a 37-year-old drug dealer, who got her involved in prostitution. That's how her journey started. And she was living in child protection It had a history of domestic, physical and sexual abuse before that. As I say, I don't take any pleasure in demonstrating that as an example. But if the best that the pro-legalization movement can put forward as a lead applicant are individuals that come from such a tragic history, I have to question the argument today that they chose this. Okay? So this is a debate. There are people who will stand up and walk out of a talk when I say these statements. That's part of the problem is we can't have it. There's not a very civil debate right now on this issue. And so I think it needs to happen, and it will happen, because regardless of what the Supreme Court of Canada does in the end, whether they strike down the current laws or uphold them, I'm going to keep arguing that the status quo doesn't work, that legalization has not proven to be effective, and that the Swedish model is really the best way forward. So we've got time for another question or two. But that was a bit of a can of worms, as you recognized. Yeah, thank you for asking it. I'm happy to answer questions not about the issue, but also as well about the methods we used and how students were involved, or sort of broader issues like that too. Anyone else?
Hello. Hi. I have a question. Are you familiar with Bill C-4, which is on human smuggling?
Yes.
Okay. I guess the government is making a distinction. The Bill C-4 on human smuggling is a bill that essentially addresses irregular arrivals of migrants, typically by sea, so the ocean lady, the Tamil asylum seekers. The government makes a distinction between human smuggling and human trafficking. Says human smuggling, essentially, there's some kind of a consent. There's an agreement with the smuggler to be smuggled as a refugee, while as in human trafficking, there's no, by definition, there's no consent. Do you buy that distinction? And what are your views on C4, which essentially provide for the automatic detention of smuggled refugee claimants for a year without review, and et cetera?
Yes, great. Another great question. There's actually a lot of current federal legislation, including C-10, the Safe Streets and Communities Act. One of the 9 laws deals with human trafficking. This is a lot of, and there's another private member's bill Joyce Smith has based on our recommendations to change the criminal code definition. So there's a ton of law reform work. So I've actually written an assessment of C-10. It's coming out next week. I wish I'd planted that question. This is not rehearsed, right? You agree? Yeah, okay. I don't know this man yet. So it's coming out on Tuesday. It's going to be published through the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, which is a new think tank in Ottawa. So Macdonald-Laurier Institute. So it'll be released through their website on Tuesday. And so I look at C-10 in detail. So I don't think I have time to get into it now, but I'd recommend that publication. The basic question is human trafficking versus migrant smuggling. Notice I don't say human smuggling and human trafficking, right? The distinction is not only valid, but it's important and necessary, and it's consistent with international law. So I've been talking about the UN Protocol Against Human Trafficking. There's a sister treaty, or a brother treaty if you prefer. Sibling treaty, there we go. A sibling treaty which is related to migrant smuggling. So the exact same UN Organized Crime Convention has 2 treaties, one on human trafficking, one on migrant smuggling. So internationally, these are fundamentally distinct. Human trafficking is about the ongoing exploitation, the ongoing receipt of an income stream through forced labor and sex trafficking, typically. Migrant smuggling is generally, but there's exceptions, it's the one-time entry, illegal entry, okay, into a country. So some distinctions. Human trafficking, as we've talked about, can be within borders. There's no need to cross borders. Okay? Migrant smuggling is primarily an offense against national sovereignty. It's an immigration violation. Now, under the Migrant Smuggling Protocol, countries are not supposed to criminalize smuggled migrants just because they're a smuggled migrant, but it does recognize the possibility of detaining them. It does recognize that there are not a sort of a laundry list of services that they should be entitled to. Whereas the Trafficking Convention says you're a victim of crime. You could not have consented to this, even if there's alleged consent, because of deception and fraud and so forth. And so you have to have access to these social services. So the problem comes in 2 ways, just briefly. One is, are there situations when you may begin as a smuggled migrant, and then you haven't fully paid off your smuggling fee, and that then becomes a debt bond you pay off through working in a sweatshop or in a brothel. That can and does happen. Okay? But if you stop it at the border before there's been that exploitation, even though that theoretically can occur, so dealing with C4, I've spoken to the minister's staff about trafficking. I think we're actually going to hear some public statements on that, more explicitly exempting trafficked persons from C4. So I expect that to come because there is a ministerial discretion, as you're no doubt aware, for the minister to exercise discretion to exempt individuals that are part of a mass arrival. So we're going to see something on that, I expect, not to speak out of school too much here. But the real problem is with respect to the refugee issue, because there's an interface with the Refugee Convention as well. Okay? Now, the issue with smuggled migrants, James Hathaway, you might have seen a piece he wrote in the National Post. He has this sentence. He says, unlike in Europe, this is almost a direct quote, but it is from memory, so just bear with me. Unlike in Europe, in Canada, all smuggled migrants are refugees. He actually makes that claim. I'm not exaggerating that. I quoted in my paper. That's false. That's not true. Smuggled migrants entering Canada include economic migrants. People talk about so-called queue jumping. That is a form of queue jumping. It's not for a refugee. There's no queue to come to Canada as a refugee, right? It can include people who are inadmissible for criminality who are not refugees, people who may think they're refugees but turn out not to be after an independent review, and it will involve legitimate refugees as well. So smuggled migrants are a complicated mix of individuals. And so that's why they're not all going to just be people you say, well, yes, detain and deport them. This model is going to have some problems with that. So I'll preview for you just a bit of the recommendations in the paper. I think we do need to recognize that migrant smuggling, as the United Nations does, is not an acceptable way for legitimate refugees even to seek to enter Canada. It's a bit of a deal with the devil, is what it is. And so we need to do things that will more severely go after the smugglers themselves, which everyone seems to be on board with. I personally support having some form of disincentives, but not detention. That's not supposed to be a form of a punitive measure under the Refugee Convention. So what I've recommended is, and also, of course, some of you know the Sharkawi security certificate decision. In my view, Sharkawi answers this, where the detention period was 120 days. The Supreme Court said, no, there must be an initial review in 48 hours. I do not see any version of events whereby you can say a smuggled migrant is not entitled to at least the same initial review period of 48 hours. So I made some recommendations that would change the detention review provisions with respect to the timeframes for review. And then secondly, giving an explicit exemption for minors, that would actually be in the provision. So I generally support the bill with those two amendments. My final comment, I think we do have to end now, is we're in an environment that's become very partisan and very polarized. And I think it's a difference. And I'm not sure if it's a function of the majority government or what it is, but it's very problematic. What we used to see is the political parties can be partisan and polarized, but the public debate is either legalized prostitution or status quo, right? Does everyone see this? There's no room for some sort of middle ground. Similarly with this, you're either you're with us or you're against us, right? We're gonna lock you up for a year, or we're gonna say you're all refugees and you should all just be immediately given status in Canada, even though some of these individuals have criminality and terrorist links as well. So there has to be some sort of middle ground that's more acceptable, and so that's kind of the course that I'm attempting to chart. But I know that this report will be controversial because there are groups that vehemently want to see someone come to Canada no matter how you get here, legally, illegally. Just once you're here and go about your business. But I think there's some problems with that. So, what I want to end with is a bit of a high note. It's just a 3-minute clip, and then we will leave it there. I'd encourage you, I think we have a lunch to get to, so maybe afterwards, if you could just keep track of my contact info, and I'd love to follow up with any of you faculty, students, in particular, about this issue and the research. But I always feel bad about leaving you with a bit of a heavy note. So what I'm going to show you is just a brief video. It's 3 minutes long, like I said, and it's from survivors. And I think it leaves us on a bit of a high note, which is where I'd like to end the day. Just bear with me here. We'll try to get the clip up. And this is actually an award-winning video that a group of survivors of sexual exploitation in BC created. And it's called We Were Built to Last. So I think it's kind of a neat... Here we go. It's a really neat place to end. Here we go. This is it. So thanks.
Do you feel like no one understands? Have you ever had a secret that you wanna hide? Somebody stole a moment that you can't get back. Do you wonder if you'll ever be the same inside? Do you feel that you're all alone, broken into pieces? pieces that you can't piece back. Somebody try to tell you that you're on your own. I know you're strong enough, cause we were built to last. I'm gonna make amends. I know I'll heal my past. I wanna start again, cause we were built to last. I'm gonna make amends. I know I'll heal my past. I wanna start again, cause we were built to last.
You're not alone, see a lot of people know what it's like to be so young and have somebody do you wrong. Somebody that you trust, maybe someone that you love and spend a lifetime trying to heal up what they you done. See, there's nowhere you can run when there's nowhere you can hide, cause you're haunted by the memories that trapped up in your mind. And you blame yourself for everything and keep it on the side. When you look into the mirror and it makes you wanna cry. When you're begging on your knees with your fists up to the sky. You're so angry at injustice and so desperate for reply. And just when you figure that you're right about to crash, say it with me now,
cause we were built to
see, there's people in the world that'll take their power back. Be the people who stand up and make a change that's gonna last. And take back your freedom, free yourself from your past. And mean it when you say it, come on.
We were built to last. I'm gonna make amends. I know I'll heal my past. I wanna start again, cause we were built to last. I'm gonna make amends. I know I'll heal my past. I wanna start again, cause we were built to last.
Sometimes I think about how easy our lives can change frequently. We're always up and we're down, and struggle makes it hard to have the things we need immediately. So sometimes when we're in trouble, it's easy to drown. I've seen a lot of people slip, get caught in the grind, and you can lose your grip and lose track of the times. And as we press on, we can lose ourselves and do things we never meant to and abuse our health. But through it all, through the fall, through the hustle and haul, we're still pushing and we're standing steady, ready and tall. There's always room to make a difference in the path we choose, and we can heal from any heartbreak, the scars, and bruises.
Do you feel like no one understands? Have you ever had a secret that you wanna hide? Somebody stole a moment that you can't get back. Do you wonder if you'll ever be the same inside? Do you feel that you're all alone, broken into pieces that you can't piece back? Somebody try to tell you that you're on your own. I know you're strong enough, cause we were built to last. I'm gonna make amends. I know I'll heal my past. I wanna start again, cause we were built to last. I'm gonna make amends. I know I'll heal my past. I wanna start again, cause we were built to last.